Boardroom Bound, Episode 78, The Boardroom Through the Eyes of an ESG Expert, with Paul Washington.
We are now in the first phase of a rolling set of crises. We had a health crisis, an economic crisis, and now we've got a social crisis. And corporate citizenship, how the company is serving its communities, what positions it's taking on public policy matters that go beyond its narrow corporate interests, those are all moving up.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we're speaking with Paul Washington. Paul runs the ESG Center at the Conference Board, and prior to that, he worked for a dozen years at Time Warner, where he was the corporate secretary. And this is someone who understands the boardroom. He was involved in at least 689 different board-type meetings when he was there. That's a lot of knowledge. And combine that with some recent research and findings that they've been publishing in the Conference Board, and we have a lot to talk about today. Let's jump into the show. Paul Washington, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Well, this is incredibly topical stuff that we're going to cover today, and this is a fast-changing world. Things have moved more than we could have expected in the last few months, and it's great to see and hear from someone who's at the forefront of that with what you guys are thinking about. When I think about the Conference Board, I'm thinking about sort of a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank, been around over 100 years. You guys are well known for putting out great information, but the ESG group that you look after, fairly new, so clearly on the rise, lots of information, you're connecting with all the right people, and you've got a fabulous background, which really, for our audience, is going to frame this so well. And we'll talk about your history in a second. I'd love you to share that with us, but I know from when you were at Time Warner, we were joking about this before, 689 different board meetings you've attended. So you've been there and you've done that. And you've seen the fun and the boring parts of it and everything in between.
That's for sure. Yeah, and I was at Time Warner for about 19 years, but I think we had about 50 years worth of experience in those 19 years.
But you had a lot of experience before that. I mean, if you go back early in your career, there was the saving loans crisis when you were the corporate secretary for Dime Savings Bank in New York. So let's just frame this up for our audience. You have experienced a great lifetime of knowledge that we're going to be sharing with a lot of us today. So how did the career begin? How did you end up where you are today?
Sure. Well, there have been a few phases. After college, I had worked in government for a little bit, but then I worked in government even during college. Then I worked for government. I worked in the House of Representatives, and then for the New York State Lieutenant Governor as his speechwriter and policy advisor, and then left that for banking. And I went down to the Dime Savings Bank of New York in 1989 to be special assistant to the chairman, thinking that this is going to be a fun and interesting and not terribly taxing gig. The savings and loan industry was not, it was not sort of cutting edge. And I walked into the S&L crisis. So we, at that point, the bank really ran into a buzzsaw, and we were rated a number 5 by the FDIC, which is in danger of imminent seizure. And within a year and a half, we transformed ourselves in terms of our capital structure and our governance, and we're then rated a 1, which is the highest categorization you can have, and we're the only bank that ever did that. And that kind of got me hooked on corporate governance right then and there, because I saw relatively small changes in governance can make a big difference in board performance, can make an even bigger difference in corporate performance. So while I was working at the bank by day, went to law school at night, graduated, clerked at the D.C. Circuit, Supreme Court, did some private practice, and then went to Time Warner, where I had my 19, almost 20-year career. The bulk of that serving in the governance area as corporate secretary and so forth. And along the way, taught law school, served on a bunch of nonprofit boards, and so coming to the Conference Board right now and heading the ESG Center is kind of a perfect capstone to all of that. It combines nonprofit experience,
Well, you have such a fabulous background for our audience to be learning from today, someone who's been there and done it and seen it from many different perspectives, from being a board member to serving the board to helping them figure out the different crises that they're going through today and in the past. And you made a really interesting point there about how almost small things can make a big difference with the board. And maybe we can start there, because for many board members, if they're early in that career, you're just thinking about it, it's very different from when you are an executive and you're doing the work and rolling up your sleeves. There's a fine line between that. And especially when you think about from the ESG perspective of how do you help an organization move in the right direction, but from the board's role of sort of the nose in, fingers out approach, you've probably seen from the 689 and different types of board experiences you've had, what's the right way for someone to think like, this is a good way to be a director?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I would say sometimes, whether you're talking about a nonprofit board or a for-profit corporation, and almost of any size, sometimes the people who have the hardest time making a transition from their executive position to the boardroom are people who are more entrepreneurial, and who have been sort of the founder of a corporation or something like that, or of an entity, who are used to calling their own shots, because they really have to make a transition from being able to get their way quickly on things to being part of a collaborative decision-making body, and understanding that they, as an individual director, unless it's been delegated to them by the board, have really no authority on their own. So they only have collective authority. And so, for someone who's stepping into the role, I think understanding the general role of a director, and then knowing that you do actually have substantial power, even as an individual director, and just asking the right questions, which means being informed about the business and knowing what the cutting edge issues are, but then asking really thoughtful questions in the right kind of way that is respectful of management, but still causes them to bring their best game. And I think moving the companies forward in the area of having a greater sense of corporate citizenship, greater environmental awareness, addressing a lot of the pressing social issues that are facing companies these days and society these days, is something that boards can do, and individual directors can do. Really, just they can do it through voting on things and so forth, but sometimes just by asking the right questions in a way that get other directors to acknowledge the validity of the issue, and then getting management to respond, can have an enormous impact.
And when you're a board director, let's say you're new or you're just aspiring, wondering what it's going to be like, there's probably only a few things that if you really get right, make a massive difference to an organization. And one example would be, we probably often think of the CEO. And I would say the board's role is to find that individual, bring them on board, look after them well, and at some point it might be time for them to be replaced, whether they retire, etc. That is clearly one sort of topic. If you try to boil it up for people to think, like, if you're going to be a really good board director, just focus on these couple of things, what would you describe it as?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's actually a core part of it. But I think, which is making sure you've got the right CEO. But I also think that you need to think about management as a team. And one thing I've learned going through CEO successions is that when you've got a change in a CEO, you really have to think about the overall team and how they work together. So I would say opening the aperture of the board's oversight beyond the CEO and include the senior management team. And of course now, frankly, overall human capital management, making sure that the company has, the right capabilities. And think about the human capital of an organization as a strategic asset. A director can make a significant difference, again, by asking the right questions in this. Like, you've got this great strategy, but do you have the people at all the different levels of the organization to carry out this strategy? So helping to make human capital management part of the company's overall strategic planning process is a place where a director can make a big contribution. Another thing that directors can do to really make a contribution is make sure that they understand the company's business. That's a challenge for directors who are coming on as independent, because they may not have much connection with the industry or with the business, but really getting up to speed on the business. And then, frankly, staying on top of industry developments. And so that means going off to industry conferences. Hopefully the company will pay for that, as they should. Reading investment analyst reports. So you really stay on top of the business, because as a director, you should regard yourself as a strategic asset for the company. And so keeping an eye on making sure that you as the director are asking the right questions about whether the company is responding appropriately to the big strategic challenges is, I think, an area where boards and individual directors can make a big difference. But it requires work. It's not something that you can just step into the role and immediately add value. It actually requires a fair amount of effort to get up to speed on the business. So I think getting up to speed on the business and focusing on areas, not exclusively, but an area, for example, which is increasingly important, of the human capital, about the workforce, are couple areas where a director can make ways in which a director can make a real contribution.
Well, I'd love to pick up on what you were just talking about there about the strategy, right? There clearly an organization should have had thoughts about what they were going to be doing at this time during the year, but those plans in some ways are out the window because of the COVID-19 situation they're all in. The strategies are changing. We might just be tactical. We might not be too strategic today. Crisis is probably the name of the game, and part of that is going to be how are you looking after your people, to pick on what you were just talking about. But clearly, as the businesses reopen, that the challenges facing the board and senior management are just going to increase. And I know that you guys had recently published a report that really, I would say, gives a roadmap for the issue the boards are going to need to pay attention to. You surveyed, about 230 different people to get their input into it, and would love to hear about some of what came out of that for our audience to learn from.
Sure. I think the overriding message is that you've done a great job in the initial phase, boards of directors, but now it's only going to get harder. In the initial phase, boards stepped up their communication with management. They held more meetings. They focused on 3 areas across the board. It's 230 companies we surveyed, across industries and across company size. They focused on 3 key issues. They focused on liquidity, employees, and operations. So that made a whole lot of sense. But now things are going to get harder. So we asked, respondents, what were the top 3 issues that you addressed? And the ones I just mentioned were the ones that were across the board, the ones people talked about most. The bottom 3 issues were actually customers, cyber, and corporate citizenship. And those bottom 3, there's a menu of 11. Those came out at the bottom. But if you think about it, now customers are absolutely key. You've got to make sure customers are willing to come back. They feel comfortable coming back, whether you're a B2C or a B2B firm. You've got to do that. Cyber is going to be increasingly important. Every company is going to be collecting a lot of more personal and medical information about their workforce, even about maybe their customers, and they're going to need to make sure that that information is properly managed. And then, of course, corporate citizenship. We are now in the third phase of a rolling set of crises. We had a health crisis, an economic crisis, and now we've got a social crisis. And corporate citizenship, how the company is serving its communities, what positions it's taking on public policy matters that go beyond its narrow corporate interests, those are all moving up. So you've got a whole lot of issues that are now moving up for boards to address. A couple other areas that are going to be critical. The whole area of disaster preparedness is just something that companies are going to need and boards are going to need to focus on. Most companies haven't looked at succession planning. Again, they probably should. The majority of companies found that their disaster preparedness plans were inadequate. Only about half the companies have updated them. That's on the list to do. Your crisis management team, it's very good for the board to ask who's on it. We found, quite to my surprise, that over half the companies surveyed did not have human resources on their crisis management team.
Wow.
And in a crisis that affects the employee population like this, or workforce population, not to have HR, I think is a pretty big gap in general, but right now it's a particularly big one. And then the final area where boards can really have a lot of work to do, but it's important, is asking management, what is the impact of this pandemic on your longer-term sustainability initiatives? And we define sustainability as those initiatives that are designed to advance the long-term welfare of the company, its stakeholders, society, and the environment. We found that companies were all over the lot, and whether they thought it increased the emphasis, decreased the emphasis, put it on hold, had no impact, or maybe shifted the emphasis. So I think, there are a lot of reasons for that wide disparity of views, but I think the overriding message is boards, ask your management what the impact is of the current set of crises on your longer-term sustainability initiatives. Come up with a coherent story and then convey that story to your investors and other stakeholders, because they are very eager to know what you think the impact will be on your longer-term sustainability initiatives. Investors are not letting up on that. So the job, unfortunately, is going to get harder for directors now for a while, and because there are a lot of constituencies out there who are looking for sustained transparency from companies on a whole broader array of issues. It goes much beyond your earnings guidance. They want to know how you're dealing with all of these challenges, what your plans are for reopening and so forth. It's your employees, it's your customers, it's investors. And so companies really need to be on boards in sort of a high state of alert in terms of communication with multiple constituencies for the foreseeable future. That's something boards and companies are not necessarily used to doing, other maybe in an activist situation.
Paul, there's so much there that we could pick apart. Now, I'd love, let's just start here, because we've talked about this a couple times, about the human capital of an organization. And
Yeah.
I'd also, in some ways, like to tie this into board composition and diversity. And I know you guys are actively working on an upcoming piece about that. When I look at the changing landscape in the boardroom, we've seen more emphasis on things like cyber, technology, if you want to call it that, as a bucket, certainly social media type, marketing type information. And with the social unrest coming up now, that is also gaining more clarity. But also, I'm seeing more chief HR officers being put in the boardroom. People are understanding that that is important. And the way you're highlighting now, it's like this is essential. And to some organizations have overlooked it. Did you find any correlation between organizations that had made that part of the board, maybe paying more attention to it, versus others that hadn't adopted that yet?
No, we really actually haven't thus far. Companies are sort of, again, I think they're still at the earlier stages of bringing on people with human resources expertise, or specific human resources expertise, onto their boards. But we are seeing, so there are relatively fewer of those. There are more companies that have incorporated human resources or human capital into the mission of one or more of their committees. Often it's the compensation committee, sometimes it's the nominating committee. But even beyond those number of companies that have changed their governance structures, there are even more who are in fact doing something in this area. And you can read about them in their proxy statements, and they're talking about what they're doing to oversee human capital. But it's interesting, those are companies that, so the companies who are doing more in this area of overseeing human capital, it's a greater number than those who have made governance changes, and it's a greater number than those who have brought on, HR experts. I do think, though, that one thing you want to do is, companies should be looking at bringing on people with that depth of background, but just as it's important to have a diversity of professional experiences, it's still very important to have all of your directors, no matter what their background, and I'm talking about diversity in its broadest sense, they still also have to have sort of things in common: integrity, good business judgment, ability to work together in a collegial and, in a constructively critical / collegial environment, and all of that, and frankly be utility infielders, because you never know what's going to come over the transom when you're on a board. So I think having broad gauge directors with some specific expertise is great. And if you can't have that on your board, the board has the authority and your committees have the authority to bring on the experts to help them. So, for example, just as compensation committees have outside comp consultants to help them figure out what information they should be looking at and constructing and overseeing compensation programs, boards may want to think about having a human resources expert working for your board or for your committee to say, okay, we know that our workforce should be a strategic asset. What are the performance indicators that we should be looking at when it comes to human capital at our organization. And then that outside expert can work with management to help make sure the board has the right reports. So even if you don't have someone on your board, boards have the capability of bringing in the outside expertise. And then finally, I'd add, even if you have a single great expert in an area, that can be risky sometimes too. You really have to make sure that the board overall is, certainly your committee members, are educated enough to be able to ask the right questions. It can be risky to rely too much on a single director as your expert in the field.
It's interesting you say that, because I'm envisioning back to what you talked about at the beginning of this episode of your amazing experience, for example, from Dime Savings Bank and how that grew and developed. The board, I want to call professionalization, has changed dramatically over the last few decades, probably to the point where it looked nothing like what it was when you first started, probably for good overall, right? We've seen a lot of, whether it's regulations, you talked about stockholders and shareholders and their interest in corporate governance, but just the people working in this space, their credentials, their background, their education, for the good of it. And I wonder, when we think about the crisis that we've gone through now, you talked about the savings and loan crisis before, it probably felt very different in the boardroom then versus now. Clearly, people's fiduciary obligations are also very different still. Any thoughts on that? And I imagine that is also partly going to be driving a bit of the board composition changes going forward.
Yeah, I think there's been an increased professionalization of boards. I mean, way back when, and it's been a long time since I started in this area, about 30 years. It was not unusual for board members to show up and have a very nice leather-bound, binder in front of them with all the materials that they would be dealing with at that meeting, and lots of numbers, not a lot of narrative, and they found out when they got into the room what they would be voting on. And most of what the board did, sometimes it was governed by regulation, but a lot of it was just by tradition. And so over time, and a lot of it happened because of the Enron and WorldCom collapse with Sarbanes-Oxley and the Dodd-Frank. There's been an increased degree of regulation. Certain court cases, the Disney decision, increased set of things the compensation committee should be doing. So the regulation has driven the increased professionalization of boards and of the people who support the boards. But it goes beyond the law. And I think one thing that's really clear to me is that to be successful in this area, and what really drives a higher level of performance, is not just making sure that your board is doing what's required by the law, but by doing what's right, in terms of the business, which means really understanding the business and that works for the board, that works for management, that works for the shareholders, and works for other stakeholders. And I think viewing anything that goes on in the boardroom through those prisms of, okay, so good for the business, good for the board, good for management, good for shareholders, and good for other stakeholders, employees, customers, society at large, brings not just a sort of higher level of professionalism to the whole area of corporate governance, but frankly brings a higher level of mission to it, and helping to make sure that you're doing right by the company and by society at large. And I think that makes it a really exciting area to be in, particularly now.
Well, I guess another topic related to that one, I think the professionalization of boards, is probably on director compensation, because that has changed so much over the years. And there's a lot of data out there for public companies, depending on where you fall, say large cap, small cap, but still there's quite a range between it. Trying to find the right way to compensate directors is tricky, but also there's so much more tension now between what shareholders and stakeholders are thinking about in their priorities. I know this is also something that you guys have been working on as a information for people to think about their compensation structure and processes. I'd love if you could tell us some more insights from what you've gleaned.
Sure. So I think boards are actually at a crossroads here in some ways in figuring out what their compensation structure should be. Because on the one hand, and this is in a report the Conference Board recently came out with, companies are looking for sort of non-traditional directors. They're looking for directors with particular kinds younger directors. They're looking for directors with more diverse ethnic and racial and geographic backgrounds, and folks who may be younger in their careers and just don't have a whole ton of money set aside already, so that and who don't have the same sort of networks that longer serving, more traditional CEO type directors have. And so they may be looking for a different kind of experience as a director. They may be looking for a company that will match charitable contributions, so more in the way of perks, if you will. They may be looking for companies that offer more director education and networking opportunities. Send me off to an industry conference, that can help serve the company by having a more informed director and so forth. They may need a little bit more of an upfront equity grant because they may not have the independent means to meet the stock ownership expectations early on. The tricky thing for companies, though, is that you can't kind of reorient your entire director compensation program just to meet the needs of this new cohort of directors that you want to bring on. It is possible to have a couple different programs that directors can sign up for, but remember, board is a collegial body, it's a collaborative body, it's a collective body, and having different compensation structures or skewing your overall structure to try to attract a particular kind of director can be a problem for boards. So there's a difficult but challenging balance here. How do we have a structure that appeals to a broader, different kind of potential director base, while still doing right and not upsetting the apple cart for your current directors? So two things. This is the crossroads. Boards might try to add a lot of bells and whistles to their compensation program to try to attract new directors. Another approach, frankly, might just be simplifying and saying, look, the board role is sort of a full-time role. It's a year-long role. We have, as anything illustrates the COVID pandemic does, we have no idea what the workload is going to be at any time, and it might be a different committee. Your nominating committee and governance committee, if it handles public policy and reputation, may be working harder than your comp or audit committee right now. So maybe having all these different fees and all these different leadership stipends and all that kind of stuff might not be the best thing. Maybe we just simplify compensation and say, all right, we're going to give you, a decent amount of money so that we don't get independently wealthy directors on. We're going to give you some restricted stock units, maybe not options, so that you've got an equity stake. Maybe we give you a bit of an upfront equity grant, but we're going to make you hold on to it for a while. And then let's, for all directors, make sure that you've got good continuing education. That gives your newer directors networking opportunities. Make sure all of your directors have access to the latest information to help them be good directors. So I think, companies with director compensation may, they might want to add some bells and whistles to attract new directors, but that can be a problem. So I think, companies will have to figure out whether they want to complicate or simplify their comp structures and hopefully come up with something that works for all of their directors, including but not limited to the new directors they're trying to attract. So that's a bit of a long answer, but, it is a really kind of really interesting area that I think it's been a bit of a backwater, but now is going to become even more important as boards are looking to maybe bring on some directors who, have a good sense of the board's role and the company's role in society. That used to be something companies did more frequently. That sort of faded. But, bringing on your university presidents or your community college presidents, people who are connected with the community, you may want some of those people on your board to help provide a little bit of, a reality check for the organization.
Well, Paul, there's no question the boardroom has changed dramatically from when you started in the career, but we know it's going to be changing a lot in the future, and you've given us a lot of great insights to that today. And we actually talked about how organizations are embracing a new model for what the board should look like. And it doesn't have to just be a sitting CEO or former CEO or even just the CFO. It can go beyond that. Maybe someone who hasn't made the C-suite but might be an equivalent role to that or leading a division. But like you've talked about, either other candidates out there. So if there are people listening going, I know this is something I wanted, this sounds really cool and exciting, what's your top tip for someone thinking, great, I am ready for this, I'm eager for this, how do I actually go and make it happen for myself? There's so much you need to do, but what do you think the most important thing is they should focus on?
So I think part of it is looking for opportunities. And one thing I would recommend to folks is figure out what companies, what industry might be interesting to you. And, actually you can look at their governance policies and figure out when they're likely to have a vacancy on the board. So you can actually do that with public companies. You can kind of get a sense where their retirement policy or whatever, it looks like they may need to bring on someone with, this is an industry I'm interested in. It looks like they may be bringing on someone. And I would do what you can to try to get, whether it's through a search firm or whatever, to get your name before those companies a couple of years in advance, 18 months to 2 years in advance of when there might be an opening at a company. So I think that's a sort of tactical thing, which is, this is a job search, go and look for it. But I think the best thing that you can do overall are really two things. The first is stay abreast of governance development and really understand the evolving role of the board of directors. And then, frankly, continue to do whatever you're doing and do it well, and establish yourself as someone with good leadership skills and good judgment and a good, strong track record. So I think if you've got a strong track record in whatever your field may be, if you've got an awareness of, governance and you're up to speed on that, and frankly, if you're conscious of the opportunities, then I think those three things will combine to give you a really good chance of landing a good spot. And, obviously just the overall networking and getting your name out there.
Well, Paul, we've covered...
But I think it's a lot about substance. I would say this is not just a networking game these days. It's not just whom you know and who knows you. You really want to make sure that you're bringing substance to bear.
And I was just going to say, you've brought substance to bear for us from your tremendous experience. And I love what you're doing with the ESG group over at the conference board. And thank you for sharing the insights from some of the recent publications you've had, as well as giving us some hints about the one that's coming up on board composition. And I would just like to thank you for sharing all of your insights and helping all of our audience to be more boardroom bound.
Thank you very much. Really, it was a pleasure, Alexander.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Paul Washington. This is someone who has learned an awful lot from the board space, from nearly 700 different meetings he's been involved with, and shared a lot of phenomenal insights that he is bringing to the conference board. We talked about several of the publications that they've recently come out with. There's a lot that all of us were probably challenged with to think about and how to do things better in a boardroom, and that is incumbent upon us. We're always supposed to be learning, growing, developing, especially during the crazy times that are happening now. Business is changing very quickly. We all need to try and keep up. Now, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you will get links to all of the resources that we talked about today. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.